So during this 90 minutes, you're going to hear from me regarding angular deformity. A patient of mine who's 46, who is 27 years out from her motor vehicle crash, and she's had 15 surgeries in that time, and she's never stopped draining. When she presented to me, she'd had 2 months of acute worsening of her thigh pain, and her drainage had changed from clear to bloody. These were her injury films, some intermediate films of failure along the way. She has a chronic draining sinus, some cellulitis. She's short, externally rotated, but surprisingly her labs are normal. So what are you going to do with this? Primarily sagittal plane deformity with chronic osteomyelitis. At the end of this talk, you'll see what I did, and at the end of the 90 minutes, you'll get some ideas of what my colleagues would do with it through some of the other techniques that we use. So my goals for you, my objectives are going to be to review the essentials of deformity analysis, because you cannot create an osteotomy and correct angular deformity without understanding exactly where the deformity is. And we'll go over some indications and some of the corrections that we use, including special problems for non-union and infected non-union. So my three main indications for malunion repair are a painful functional deficit and risk for degenerative arthritis, and that's usually presenting as some form of pain like knee pain. Unacceptable cosmetic appearance or lifestyle interference, where it's just allowing them, not allowing them to do the things they want to do. So when we try to determine what degree of mechanical axis deviation requires correction, that's just really hard to pinpoint. I think there's a lack of consensus about what type of correction, but if you listen to the patient, they're going to tell you if it's something they can live with or not. The main contraindication for me is that the soft tissue must be able to handle the surgical approach, but not only the surgical approach, but with angular deformity, you have a lot of tension on the skin, and so it has to be able to handle that correction. Some indications are more absolute than others. And therefore, the complexity of the solution should match the complexity of the problem. Nobody would argue that this 16-year-old girl with this varus short malunion would benefit from correction, but you may think that this is a more acute problem with varus malunion, non-union, and failing hardware. And this is even more urgent with dead bone and a draining sinus and a downright hostile soft tissue environment. So the solutions for all of these are going to be very different, even though the concepts of the deformity corrections are going to be similar. So let's go over some of the principles of deformity correction here. You've heard over the course of these weeks about single and double and multiplane deformities. I took the sawbone on the left, model A, and I modified it to the sawbone on the right, model B. Each of these has a coronal plane deformity of 20 degrees. But I induced also an apex posterior deformity of 12 degrees on the model B. So does the model B have a multiplanar deformity? Not really. It's just like model A. It has a single deformity. It's just not in the same plane. And you have to be able to calculate that plane of deformity, the maximum and minimum deformities that are associated with that angulation. So if you're good at math, you can use the techniques on the left. If you're not good at math, you can just use graph paper, a ruler, and a protractor, and you can come up with the same, basically the same analysis. So this is how I do it. I get an XY plane on some graph paper, and I map out on the coronal plane on the x-axis and the sagittal plane on the y-axis, and I map out what is the deformity in each of those planes. So in the coronal plane, it's a 20-degree deformity. In the sagittal plane, it's a 10-degree deformity, and where those 2 points meet is the magnitude. The length of that line is the magnitude in degrees, and how far off that coronal plane is the direction. So if you were to look at it from that angle, you would see no deformity, as I'm showing you in the bottom right, and 90 degrees orthogonal to that would be the maximum plane. And you have to know those in order to be able to calculate your deformity and plan your deformity correction. So coupled with this maximum and minimal plane deformity, you need to understand the principles of deformity correction, and I highly recommend this book by Dror Paley, It goes through painstaking detail, the Cora method, along with some rules. If you want to see the basics of it come alive, there's a really nice YouTube, and that's available to you. The author has given me permission to use some of the clips in here. Cora is the center of rotation of angulation. That's basically where the anatomic axis of the proximal and distal segments meet. The angulation correction axis, or the ACA, is the point around which you spin one fragment with relationship to the other to gain your correction. And where your Cora lies and how you spin it is going to affect not just the angular correction, but also translation and length. So let's go over those concepts kind of quickly here. The Cora, as I mentioned, is here. This green line is the bisector of that angulation. So this is the halfway point. And anywhere along this green line is going to be a Cora. It's going to be a place where you can get your correction. So this brings us to the first rule of Paley's Cora method, where as long as you're along this, this bisector line and you rotate, you're going to get collinear realignment. So that's the difference between opening and closing wedges. They're both along that same line. They're both considered Coras. Their ACA are in different places, but they correct your alignment without any residual deformity. A modification or an application of that is when you do an oblique osteotomy. As long as your osteotomy passes through that ACA, you're still going to get collinear realignment with a realignment and correction of your angular deformity. You'll still have some residual deformity at the level of the osteotomy, but your overall correction will be good. The second rule is also applicable for us today, and that is as long as you keep your ACA in the center of your Cora, it doesn't matter where your osteotomy is, above and below, you're still going to get collinear realignment. You'll have some deformity, but you'll still get that collinear realignment. And that's applicable to what I'm going to show you with a focal dome osteotomy, but also with even with what Matt Graves is going to show you with a clamshell. You can break one of these rules and create a translation. If your osteotomy is not at the bisector line and your ACA, your rotational axis is also not there, you're going to correct your angle deformity, but you're going to create a translation. Now, if they have a mechanical axis deviation, then you can actually use that to your advantage. So if you have an angular deformity with translation, you can use that to your advantage and correct translations as well, but that makes it even more complicated. Now, an application of this is called the focal dome osteotomy. This involves rule 2, where if you have your Cora and your ACA is at the center of your Cora, you can cut below it and rotate it. So if you have a dome osteotomy there, you can create a correction without an opening wedge that leaves a bone gap, or a closing wedge, which would shorten your construct. So it is a beneficial osteotomy. But if you break that rule with the focal dome, as you see here, if your axis that you rotate your dome around does not match the Cora, then you're going to get angular correction, but you're going to also get translation, which would lead to a mechanical axis deviation. So I've got a bunch of models here. You can choose basically any of these osteotomies on a sawbone to correct it, but in the patient, you're going to have different requirements depending on your soft tissue and your other needs. An opening wedge osteotomy is basically the simplest osteotomy you can do. Even for some complex looking deformities, you can do single transverse osteotomies, and if the canal is capacious enough, you can simply correct it. You leave open gaps, but you can get those to heal. It's different than a clamshell. Just a couple tips about the opening wedge osteotomy, where you make sure you get it at your Cora. You cut, and you can cut just the near cortex, the opening wedge Cora location with a saw, and then the rest of it you can use an osteotome for, and then you have a lower energy osteotomy, less heat, because these cortical osteotomies can really have a problem healing if you heat them up too much, you're not careful with your saw. The closing wedge osteotomy is much less forgiving in correction than the opening wedge osteotomy, as you can imagine, because you have to have a perfect execution of your wedge. If you don't, then you're going to either get a fixed gap, or you're not going to get your correction that you're looking for. That can be combined with rotation. Here's an example that I showed you before. This is a patient of mine that I took he has his cora right here in the center of his non-union. And I decided to do a closing wedge. So here's the closing wedge cora. I added a 20-degree wedge right through his non-union site, and that excises the non-union. And not only does it treat the non-union, but that also gives me the correction that I need to get healing. So he gets a compressed, two compressed surfaces and correction of his malunion and non-union all at the same time. Some of the techniques that I use for closing wedge osteotomy, some of them are fairly obvious. You've seen these triangles in previous weeks. I use something called an acetate template where I print on clear paper angles that I'm interested in, and I have a non-scrubbed assistant put those on the monitor to make sure that the trajectory of my pins is exactly where I want them to be. I bend K-wires and I sterilize them so I have the exact angle that I want. These are a lot easier for me to use than a protractor, which is big and bulky. And here I'm going to show you just basically doing that. I put in my first wire in through the cora. Second wire I'm going to match up with that bent K-wire, make sure that that's perfect. And I start cutting, but before I complete either cut, I go about 3/4 of the way with the first cut, and then I finish the second cut. And then when you pull your wedge, you make sure that with your K-wire that it was the length that you want, and then you'll get your correction that you intended. The closing wedge, as I mentioned here, is effective for also treating the non-union. The focal dome is something that not all my colleagues love. I like this osteotomy for correction, as I mentioned, because it does not create fixed gaps and it doesn't remove bone in order to get your correction. It's just a lot harder to do in the cortical hard bone. It's really nice in the metaphysis. You can get these special saws through veterinary orthopedic instrumentation, but you can just as easily do it using a parallel drill guide, as I'm going to show you here. You get a pin through the cora, and that's your center pin, and then you set your the width of your angle guide or of your parallel drill guide to the radius that you want, and then you basically just drill around until you've completed all the areas, and then you can finish it up with an osteotome, or in this case I used a small saw. You complete your osteotomy, and then you can rotate it and compress it with no gaps. So you just have to be extremely careful in the cortex, because if you use one of those saw blades, you have to have multiple blades that get dull and they heat up, and you don't want to kill the bone as you're creating your osteotomy. So back to our first case that I was showing you. She has this primarily sagittal plane deformity, but with retained hardware and a chronic infection. You can see she has a big sequestrum. I went ahead and did 2 focal dome osteotomies at the same time as this osteomyelitis was debrided. Wide debridement and a couple of sequential debridements with antibiotic-loaded nails. As you can see, I have a gap in my distal focal dome osteotomy because my cora was not perfect, so I created a gap. And we'll see that did lead to a little bit of trouble. So here she is at 2 months. 5.5 months, she still has a persistent fracture gap or osteotomy gap. So I went ahead and bone grafted her, and then here she is at 3 years. She's been infection-free, and now she wants her leg longer. So my take-home points are that for angular deformity, this does require calculating your maximum and minimum planes of deformity, but you need to understand how to do that and apply the core method in order to get good angular correction, and you can conquer that with a number of osteotomies.